Hey everybody, so this week we're talking about the built environment as I click off this Logitech webcam controller. There we go. So today we're focusing on what is the built environment, how does that impact our health broadly, specifically how does that focus on physical activity, and last but not least we'll also have tangentially related but still what was the focus of your textbook, the discussion on housing and how housing where you live and the structure in which you live can impact your health. Before we get started, I just wanted to give you this beautiful example of built environment. This is a skyline of Phoenix at night, really focusing on downtown Phoenix. And what I want you to think about are what are all of the things that we've built and put into the natural environment of the valley, right? Whether it's the buildings, whether it's the streets, whether it's streetlights, the little green bikes that you can rent and use, the metro rail, the sports arenas that are in the area, right? These are all things we put into our environment to help us live, work, and play in Phoenix, Arizona. So to give you a definition of what exactly do I mean by built environment, well, think of it as pretty literal, right? What have we built? What have we put into our environment that, again, helps human activity? And there's some examples of large scale and small scale forms of built environment, whether it impacts your surroundings, and how we again use what is in our environment to engage in daily activities. So some large-scale examples of the built environment include housing, where we live, how we live. Do you live in a neighborhood? Do you live where, in the case of this picture, where there's a lot of crowding? Do you live on a farm, where you're farther away from other people? How does architecture influence your physical and mental health? How does, or the way, sorry, that buildings are designed, right? Um, how does waste management and municipal sanitation impact your health? How does your mode of transportation, which by the way, if any of you ride a camel ever, I will need a picture of that ASAP. Um, Especially if it's your preferred mode of transportation. And then also, how are your cities designed and how does that impact your health? We'll focus a little bit more on that when we talk about physical activity in the next set of slides. Some small scale examples, and again, just some examples, include what's put into our environment to make our daily lives easier, such as lighting and such as the computer that you're using right now to watch this lecture. And also what's put into our environment to help protect us. So there's this example of handrails and even temperature gauges to eliminate the risk of getting burned by the hot water that can come from our faucets, and but also the availability of hot water and supply of hot water so we can wash our dishes, wash our bodies, wash our clothes, right? Again, all example of small scale um, parts of our built environment that impact our daily functioning. So how did we get here? Now this picture would kind of paint, this cartoon would paint a picture of sprawl, and we'll talk about what that means, the over-reliance of our vehicles, the over-reliance of, again, using a car to get from point A to point B instead of being more physically active, using a bicycle, using, even mass transit to get from point A to point B. And also this emergence of more fast food and corner stores as your main method of getting, your food, right? Instead of having healthier options, we more often have to rely on this grab and go kind of culture of how we treat our food. So to give you just a little bit of history of the built environment in the United States, prior to what's being characterized by the pictures on this slide, people lived in a more agriculturally based society. You had your own farm animals, you grew your own crops, maybe you traded crops, maybe you traded livestock and meats and whatnot. But prior to moving into inner cities for work, people more often lived with their families and extended families in more kind of isolated living arrangements. And if they lived closer to cities, they were often more often based on water because water provided resources that were needed, and also fishing and being able to ship goods back and forth by kind of living closer to waterways. The Industrial Revolution, which again is characterized by these pictures, really took place in the United States between 1760s up until 1820s, 1840s. It was characterized by building manufacturing organizations and companies that created more jobs for people, where people were working on these assembly lines, working in these companies to get a form of payment, as well as to help construct resources that people were using and buying to make their lives easier. So with this, with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, we saw kind of this mass movement from this more individualized rural living society to moving to the cities. But at the same time, we saw that more people with this mass movement to cities and a lack of municipal sanitation, we found that people were throwing their trash and their dirt into the streets. More people were throwing also their trash into waterways. It actually wasn't until 1934 that the Supreme Court outlawed throwing your trash into waterways, right, and into the oceans, into rivers. There was crowding. There was a faster spread. When there was an epidemic, a faster spread of epidemics. It was a bit dirtier to live in inner city, right? So it was really the invention of the car that allowed people to not necessarily have to live where they work. And so this is just kind of a fun fact. It wasn't actually the Model T Ford that was one of the first cars. It was the Lizzie that was produced and put out on the market between 1908 to 1927. But it was really having this own individualized form of transportation that allowed people to move out to the suburbs. Living out in the suburbs was actually, healthier. You weren't exposed to other people's trash, lack of sanitation, and crowding. And it was actually seen as, more often people were seen as having a better financial status if they could afford to not have to work, to not have to live where they work, and to not be exposed to some of the things that you were being exposed to by living in the cities with all the manufacturing plants. So for over time, with the mass production of automobiles, there's also a need to establish and fund an increase in interstates and highways to be able to link people from where they were beginning to want to move and live back into the cities. So there were certain laws that were passed that really started funneling some of the national budget to expand our highway systems. So again, it was a sign of financial status to move out into the suburbs, and also it was better for you in a health sense to live out in these less populated areas as opposed to living in cities. So again, you saw people moving back out into housing neighborhoods and housing establishments that allowed for you to live outside of these less healthy cities. With that, we saw cities begin to sprawl. This term sprawl, think of if you think of someone sprawling out, you tend to think of them as like stretching out. Well, cities were beginning to be more spread out and not so centralized around the job. You would work in cities, but then you'd go back out to your communities to live and commune and spend your weekends out kind of more in the country. So the new idea of what was being successful was, again, working in cities, but driving your car and going back out to your community to live after work and, like during your weekends and breaks. So how exactly did that shape our health? How did that influence our health? Well, we started spending more time instead of walking to work, being more physically active. We spent more time in our cars commuting to and from where we worked. We spent more time also, driving individuals to where they needed to go, such as this, it says the thing of the past. People used to walk their kids or go with their kids as the children bike to school. Well, now we're driving places more often, more frequently. That leads to a decrease in physical activity. We're also more of this fast food society where we need food, we want food quickly. What do we know about fast food restaurants? They tend not to be the healthiest options, right? We're consuming more calories, we're consuming more on the go, we're being a little bit less mindful about what we're eating and consuming. And over time, that impacts weight gain, which in turn impacts your likelihood of developing um, overweight, obesity related chronic diseases. You see, with the reliance on vehicles, there's also a reliance on burning fossil fuels that leads to combustion of these fossil fuels, which have been linked to environmental pollution. If you're already living with a respiratory related chronic illness, this is going to exacerbate that health problem. You also see the increase of people getting in various forms of accidents due to spending more time in their car and also being distracted, right? So there are other ways in which the built environment impacts your health. These are just some examples. It impacts, again, we'll talk about in the next set of slides, how your built environment can influence your activity levels, physical activity, where you live, what you have access to in terms of food, as well as safe drinking water, and also how that influences your well-being. So again, this was just meant to be a broad overview of the built environment, but we'll go into a little bit more detail about physical activity specifically in the next set of slides. So I hope you find this interesting because again, what public health and what social determinants of health are all about are really understanding the context of which you live and how that shapes your opportunities or lack thereof to engage in behaviors or reduce or increase your risk for developing certain health outcomes. Okay, we're done with this part of the slides.